In the heart of Rome, an emperor once transformed his palace into a living theater of sin, where nightly feasts dissolved into wild, lawless orgies that shocked even the most jaded elites of the empire. Today, we'll uncover how absolute power, unchecked desire, and a twisted vision of pleasure turned one man's reign into the most scandalous spectacle in Roman history. And when you hear how it all ended, you won't believe it. Here's a question. If you lived in a world where the emperor could command your presence at his nightly banquets of desire, would you risk refusing him or surrender to the madness just to survive? Think about it, because the answer reveals more than you might expect later in this story. Imagine a teenager crowned as the master of the world. That was Caligula, barely in his 20s, yet suddenly the sole ruler of Rome. At first, the people adored him. He abolished unfair taxes, freed political prisoners, and staged games that dazzled the crowds. For a brief moment, Rome believed they had found a benevolent savior, but power can twist quickly. Behind the golden facade, Caligula's appetite for indulgence began to swell. He didn't just want wealth. He wanted experiences that pushed beyond the boundaries of morality itself. It's said he would prowl his own banquets, selecting senators' wives on a whim, only to parade them back humiliated before their husbands. Rome had seen excess before, but never as state policy. What began as feasting soon became theater. Caligula's banquets didn't end with wine and music. They climaxed with performances of flesh. The palace was transformed into a circus where senators, nobles, and foreign envoys were forced to watch, or worse, participate. Ancient accounts describe how entire nights blurred between political discussion and public acts of intimacy, with the emperor himself often directing the spectacle. To Caligula, the palace was not just a home. It was a stage to prove that no law, no tradition, and no god stood above his will. Some whispered it was madness. Others saw it as calculated humiliation, a way to remind the elite that their dignity existed only at his mercy. Picture walking into a temple expecting solemn prayer, only to find it repurposed as a brothel. That's what Caligula ordered when he transformed parts of Rome's most sacred spaces into extensions of his palace debauchery. Statues of gods were draped with silks, altars turned into stages for forbidden acts. For Romans, who had been raised on reverence for Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, this wasn't just scandal. It was sacrilege on a state level. Yet few dared protest openly. To oppose the emperor's whims meant risking exile, execution, or worse. Caligula wasn't just mocking tradition. He was rewriting it for his amusement. In one of his most audacious displays, Caligula ordered ships built not for war, but for floating pleasure palaces. These massive barges on Lake Nemi were decked with marble floors, lush gardens, and golden pavilions, sailing temples of indulgence. Guests were ferried aboard for nights that blurred into mornings, surrounded by music, feasting, and spectacle. Imagine the cost. Entire provinces taxed into misery so one man could drift across calm waters in floating orgies. Roman chroniclers noted the irony. While the empire fought wars abroad, its emperor staged mock naval battles laced with decadence at home. At first, Caligula's nightly gatherings seemed like excess without consequence, but soon they became tools of intimidation. Senators who displeased him were forced to attend, their wives and daughters paraded as part of the entertainment. Declining an invitation wasn't an option. It was treason. One night of absence could mean confiscated property or a staged accident. What began as indulgence transformed into public humiliation disguised as festivity. Guests didn't laugh, they feared. For Caligula, domination wasn't just on the battlefield, but in every bed, every table, every glance across the marble floors. Caligula no longer wanted to be host. He wanted to be the show. Historical accounts describe him dressing as gods, demanding worship in the middle of banquets, even appearing as Venus herself in flowing gowns, a deliberate shock to Roman masculinity. His body, his whims, his desires became state propaganda. The message was clear. If the emperor could transform himself into a deity in the palace, then Rome itself belonged to him without restraint. Some historians argue this was madness. Others see cold strategy, humiliating the elite until loyalty was indistinguishable from submission. In Rome, emperors were sometimes honored as divine after death, but Caligula refused to wait. He paraded through the palace dressed as Jupiter, Apollo, and even Venus, each identity chosen to provoke shock. He didn't just act the part. He demanded temples dedicate sacrifices to him while he was still alive. Banquets became liturgies, with guests forced to toast not to the gods of old, but to the emperor sitting across the table. To refuse was heresy. To comply was submission. Either way, Rome's most sacred traditions bent under the weight of one man's ego. Caligula's palace wasn't simply a playground. It was a weapon. Every feast blurred into staged chaos where intimacy and power collided in front of unwilling witnesses. Senators left not entertained but terrified, knowing their reputations could be destroyed by whispers of what had happened behind closed doors. Caligula knew the rumors would spread, and that was the point. To prove no one could resist his will. What looked like sin was also strategy. Humiliation as governance, excess as surveillance. For Rome's elite, survival meant surrendering even their private dignity to public debasement. Caligula's excess no longer stopped at the palace gates. He declared his horse Incitatus a priest, promising to make him consul, a mockery of Roman politics staged for the amusement of his court. Senators, already humiliated in the palace, now faced ridicule in the streets. Public money was drained to fund spectacles of absurdity, golden stables, jeweled collars, and feasts where animals were treated as honored guests, while citizens starved. This wasn't madness alone. It was a calculated inversion of values. By ridiculing the Senate, Caligula reminded Rome that real power didn't rest in law, but in his whims. By now, Caligula's palace was infamous. Rumors spread across the empire of incest with his sisters, of orgies that spilled into the public eye, of temples stripped of treasures to finance nights of luxury. Ancient sources mix exaggeration with truth, but the impact was undeniable. Rome's faith in its emperor was collapsing. The same man once hailed as a savior now stood as a warning. Even his personal guards, the praetorians, whispered about the danger of his rule. Caligula had crossed a line where indulgence became treason against the very state he embodied. If you've made it this far, you can see how one man's reign spiraled from celebration into chaos. But what you've heard so far is only half the story. The darker half comes next. So, take a second, hit that subscribe button, and stay with me, because the ending of Caligula's tale is something no one in Rome could have predicted. The first cracks appeared not among the senators, but within Caligula's own Praetorian Guard. These men had been sworn to protect him, yet they were forced to witness his nightly debauchery and endure his public humiliations. Loyalty eroded when he began executing officers on suspicion alone, replacing seasoned veterans with flatterers. Whispered alliances formed in shadowed corners, guards exchanging nervous glances during feasts, senators quietly funneling gold to buy protection. The palace that once symbolized power now echoed with paranoia. According to tradition, Caligula's end began during yet another extravagant spectacle. Guests were feasting, music roared, and the emperor once again played the god at his own table. But among the crowd stood Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian officer long mocked by Caligula for his supposed weakness. Behind his calm expression, he carried fury and a plan. The orgies of power had finally gone too far. On that night, pleasure turned into prelude for betrayal. As Caligula basked in the glow of his excess, the stage for his downfall was being set. It happened quickly, and yet Rome had waited years for it. As Caligula left the theater after a performance, he was met not with cheers, but steel. Cassius Chaerea struck first, driving his blade into the emperor's body. Other guards joined in, stabbing him dozens of times until the young ruler who thought himself a god lay lifeless on the marble floor. The palace that had echoed with laughter and music now filled with screams and chaos. The irony was inescapable. The same Praetorian Guard he relied on for protection became the instrument of his destruction. Caligula's death did not bring peace. His wife and young daughter were murdered in the chaos, erased as symbols of his bloodline. Senators debated restoring the Republic, desperate to cleanse Rome of tyranny. But the Praetorians had other plans. They discovered Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind palace curtains and hailed him as emperor. In a single night, Rome's future was decided not by law or tradition, but by soldiers and steel. The orgies ended, but the memory lingered. For Romans, Caligula's reign became a cautionary tale. Unchecked desire leads not to glory, but to ruin. Caligula's death did not erase his influence. Just 2 decades later, another emperor, Nero, would walk the same path of indulgence. Nero's golden palace echoed with music, feasts, and orgies so infamous that Roman satirists declared the empire itself was drunk. Caligula had set the precedent: pleasure as politics, spectacle as rule. For the Roman people, it became clear that once an emperor tasted divinity through desire, there was no turning back. Despite the terror, Rome could not forget Caligula. His name became a curse, whispered as proof of how far emperors could fall. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio preserved every rumor, every scandal, ensuring that generations would remember his palace not as a monument to greatness, but as a cautionary tale of shame. And yet, those same tales fascinated the Roman public. Scandal was irresistible. Even in condemnation, Caligula remained unforgettable. Caligula's story is more than a scandal of ancient Rome. It's a warning. When a leader faces no limits, when every desire is treated as law, decadence becomes destiny. His palace orgies weren't simply personal indulgence. They were symbols of how unchecked power corrodes the state itself. Once shame is normalized at the top, it seeps into every level of society. History's lesson is sharp. 2,000 years later, Caligula's reign still captures attention, not because of the salacious details, but because it forces a question. How much indulgence will people tolerate before they act? Every society struggles with the balance between pleasure, power, and morality. For Rome, that balance snapped under the weight of one emperor's excess. For us, his story lingers as a mirror, reminding us that leadership built on humiliation and indulgence is never sustainable. So what began as a young emperor's promise of renewal ended as one of Rome's darkest spectacles. Caligula's palace, once hailed as the seat of power, became a stage for humiliation, desire, and unchecked excess. His reign reminds us that absolute authority can twist even the grandest empire into theater. And when leaders mistake indulgence for strength, collapse isn't a question of if, but when. And here's the thought to carry forward. Caligula may have been the first Roman emperor to turn his palace into an orgy, but he wouldn't be the last. Which raises the question, what happens when power and pleasure collide again, and other times with other rulers? That's a story we'll uncover in the next episode. Every empire has its Caligula. The only difference is how long it lasts.